Vicious leopard cat devours little boy during playtime. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The warm afternoon sunlight streamed through the curtains of the small suburban home as young Ethan giggled, his tiny hands reaching out toward the spotted feline on the living room floor. His parents had only stepped away for a moment, leaving him to play with what they thought was a tame exotic pet, a leopard cat named Saffron. Saffron had always been an unusual pet, a wild animal rescued from illegal trafficking. Ethan's father, David, had insisted they could raise it safely, despite its untamed nature. At first, the cat had been distant, stalking the edges of their home, watching from the shadows. But over time, it had grown accustomed to its new environment, or so they had thought. Ethan clapped his hands excitedly, unaware of the warning signs. The way Saffron's tail flicked back and forth, her ears pinned slightly downward, the subtle tension in her sleek, muscular body. These were signals, predatory instincts bubbling just beneath the surface. The child giggled again, inching closer, his fingers brushing against Saffron's thick fur. Then, in an instant, everything changed. A guttural snarl ripped through the room. Before Ethan could react, Saffron pounced. The small boy barely had time to cry out as sharp claws dug into his tiny wrist, pinning him to the ground. A high-pitched scream tore from his throat, echoing through the house. From the kitchen, Ethan's mother, Claire, dropped the dish she was holding. The sound of shattering glass was drowned out by her son's terrified cries. "Ethan!" she screamed, bolting toward the living room. David burst into the room a split second later, his eyes widening at the sight before him. Ethan was on the floor, tears streaming down his face, struggling against Saffron's grip. The cat's ears were flattened, her mouth open, revealing razor-sharp fangs. She let out a deep, rolling growl, sound that sent chills down Claire's spine. David didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, hands outstretched, reaching for his son. But Saffron hissed violently, her body tightening like a coiled spring. David froze. "Don't move," he whispered, his voice tight with fear. Claire sobbed, hands covering her mouth. "Oh my God, what do we do?" Ethan whimpered, his small body trembling under the weight of the wild animal. Saffron's eyes were locked onto David, her pupils wide and unblinking. David knew one wrong move could turn this from a terrifying accident into a deadly situation. "Saffron," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay. Let go." The leopard cat's ears twitched, but she didn't release her hold. Her breathing was heavy, rapid. David's mind raced. Why was she doing this? Then he saw it. The small plush toy mouse lying just inches away from Ethan's outstretched fingers. Realization hit him like a brick. Saffron wasn't attacking. She was hunting. She had been playing with Ethan, but something had triggered her instincts. The way he had moved, the way he had reached out, she had mistaken him for prey. David's stomach tightened. If they panicked, she would attack out of fear. They had to approach this carefully. "Claire," he murmured, never taking his eyes off the cat. "Go get some raw meat from the fridge." Claire hesitated. "What?" "Just do it," he urged. Claire ran to the kitchen, her hands shaking as she ripped open the refrigerator door. Ethan let out another small sob, shifting slightly beneath Saffron's weight. The cat tensed. David's heart stopped. Then Claire was back, holding a raw chicken breast in trembling hands. "Now what?" she whispered. David swallowed hard. "Toss it slowly." Claire obeyed, gently tossing the meat towards Saffron. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, Saffron's nose twitched. Her head jerked toward the meat. David held his breath. The cat's grip loosened. Then, in a single fluid motion, she released Ethan, leaping off his small body and pouncing onto the chicken instead. Ethan scrambled backward, sobbing uncontrollably. Claire rushed forward, scooping him into her arms, her own tears streaming down her face. David didn't move. He watched as Saffron devoured the raw meat, her tail twitching, her body still alert but no longer aggressive. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Claire broke the silence. "We can't keep her," she whispered. David finally let out a shaky breath, his hands still trembling. He looked at his son, his terrified, trembling son. Then he knew she was right. Saffron wasn't a pet. She was a predator. And tonight they had come far too close to learning that lesson the hard way. The living room was eerily silent except for the soft tearing sound of Saffron finishing the raw chicken breast. The adrenaline had not yet left their bodies, and Claire still clutched Ethan tightly against her chest, rocking him gently as he sobbed into her shoulder. Her hands trembled as she brushed his hair away from his face, murmuring soft reassurances that everything was okay, even though it wasn't. David sat on the floor, his back against the couch, staring at Saffron as she licked her bloody lips, her sharp teeth glinting under the dim light. His mind was racing, playing back every moment, every mistake. They had brought a wild predator into their home and treated it like a house cat, and tonight had proved how wrong they had been. Claire's voice finally broke the silence. She has to go. David swallowed hard, looking at his wife. She wasn't just upset. She wasn't just shaken. She was terrified, and she had every right to be. Ethan whimpered, curling deeper into her arms. His small wrist bore deep, red scratches, a painful reminder of just how close they had come to losing him. David exhaled, rubbing his hands over his face. I know. Claire looked at him, searching his face as if she hadn't expected him to agree so quickly. What do we do? She whispered. David didn't have an answer. Saffron wasn't a typical pet. They couldn't just drop her off at an animal shelter. She was a leopard cat, a wild animal that should never have been in captivity. But sending her back into the wild wasn't an option either. She had lived too long in a domestic environment. She wouldn't survive. Claire wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself. We need to call someone. David nodded. I'll call animal control first thing in the morning. Claire flinched. And what are they going to do? They'll put her down, David. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. He knew she was right. Exotic animals like Saffron, when deemed too dangerous to be kept, rarely got second chances. She was either rehomed to a specialized sanctuary or euthanized. Ethan stirred, rubbing his tear-streaked face against Claire's shoulder. His small voice broke through the tension. Is Saffron bad? He sniffled. Claire's chest tightened. She kissed the top of his head. No, sweetheart. She's not bad. She just doesn't belong here. David's throat felt thick. How had they let it get this far? For the first time, he truly saw what Saffron was. Predator forced into a world she didn't understand. She wasn't evil. She wasn't malicious. She was just doing what she was built to do. And that meant keeping her here was no longer an option. Saffron let out a soft chuffing sound, licking her paws as if nothing had happened. But David noticed the way she still watched Ethan, her golden eyes unreadable. He didn't want to admit it, but a part of him wondered, what if they hadn't acted fast enough? What if, next time, they weren't so lucky? David stood up, reaching for his phone. Claire frowned. Who are you calling? I know someone, David said. A wildlife rehab specialist. They work with exotic animals, ones that need to be reintroduced into the wild or sent to sanctuaries. Claire hesitated. And if they say there's no place for her? David's jaw clenched. Then we find another way. Because no matter what, he wasn't going to let Saffron die because of their mistake. Claire watched him for a moment before nodding. Okay. She turned back to Ethan, smoothing his hair. Come on, sweetheart. Let's get you cleaned up. Ethan sniffled, rubbing his eyes. Saffron's not mad at me, is she? Claire forced a small smile. No, honey. She just got confused. Ethan looked at the cat, who still sat calmly licking her paws, completely unaware of the fear she had just caused. Then, in a tiny voice, he whispered, I don't want her to go. Claire's heart broke. I know, baby, but she needs to be somewhere she can be happy. Ethan didn't say anything else. He just clung to his mother as she carried him out of the room. David stared at Saffron one last time before pressing the call button. He just hoped it wasn't too late to fix this. David paced back and forth in the dimly lit kitchen, phone pressed tightly to his ear. Every second that passed felt agonizingly slow as he waited for an answer. The weight of the situation bore down on him. They had to find a place for Saffron and fast. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the line clicked. Dr. Miriam Carter, Wildlife Rehabilitation. Who am I speaking with? David exhaled sharply. Dr. Carter, my name is David Morris. I need help. It's about a leopard cat. There was a pause on the other end. A leopard cat? You mean the species or an actual leopard cat in captivity? David rubbed his temple. An actual leopard cat. She was rescued from an illegal exotic pet trade a couple of years ago. We took her in, but now he hesitated, his throat tightening. Now we realize she doesn't belong here, and something happened tonight. She nearly hurt my son. Dr. Carter's voice remained calm, but there was an edge of urgency to it. Where are you located? David quickly rattled off their address. She sighed. Keeping an animal like that in a domestic environment is incredibly dangerous. She's not meant to be a pet. David clenched his fist. I know that now. Pause. Is anyone injured? David's eyes drifted toward the hallway, where Claire was tending to Ethan's scratches. My son has some scratches, but it could have been worse. We need to get her out of here before anything else happens. Dr. Carter didn't hesitate. I can send someone from my team first thing in the morning. We'll assess her behavior and determine the best relocation option. David frowned. What happens if she's too domesticated to be released? There was a brief silence. Then we look at sanctuary placements. But I won't lie to you, there aren't many spots left for animals like her. If we can't place her, she may be euthanized. David's stomach dropped. That was the one thing he refused to let happen. There has to be another way, he said firmly. Dr. Carter's tone softened slightly. We'll do everything we can, but I need you to keep her calm tonight. Any more incidents could change how she's evaluated. David swallowed. Understood. Keep her in a confined space. Don't provoke her. And whatever you do, don't let her near your son. David exhaled. We'll be ready. The call ended, and he placed the phone down with a heavy heart. Claire walked into the kitchen, her face pale, exhaustion written all over her features. What did they say? She asked softly. David met her gaze. They're sending someone in the morning. But Claire, he hesitated, the words feeling like poison in his mouth. If they can't find a place for her, they'll put her down. Claire's lips pressed together, and she closed her eyes, nodding slowly. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, she whispered, Ethan's asleep. He kept asking if Saffron was mad at him. David ran a hand through his hair, guilt gnawing at his chest. He doesn't understand. Claire looked toward the living room, where Saffron lay curled up in the corner, her tail flicking slowly, her golden eyes still watching. She's just an animal, Claire murmured. She doesn't know she did anything wrong. David sighed. Maybe, but that doesn't change what almost happened. He grabbed a spare blanket and a pillow from the couch. Claire frowned. What are you doing? I'm staying up, David said, walking toward the living room. I don't trust her around Ethan, even while he's asleep. I'll keep an eye on her until morning. Claire hesitated, then nodded. Wake me if anything happens. She left him alone with the cat. David lowered himself into the armchair, watching Saffron intently. The cat stretched, yawning widely, then curled into a ball. She looked so harmless like this, so much like an oversized domestic cat. But David knew better now. And he also knew that by tomorrow, one way or another, she'd be gone. The night stretched on, heavy with tension. David sat in the dim glow of the living room, his body stiff, his mind restless. Saffron lay curled up on the rug, her sleek body rising and falling with each slow breath. She seemed calm now, but David didn't trust it. Every time he closed his eyes, even for a second, he saw the moment she had pounced on Ethan. The way her muscles had coiled, the way her claws had sunk into his son's fragile wrist. It was a predator's instinct, not a pet's reaction. And yet, she looked so peaceful now. David exhaled, rubbing his temples. He checked the clock. 3:17 a.m. The wildlife team wouldn't arrive for another few hours. He just had to keep her contained until then. Saffron suddenly stretched, her golden eyes blinking open. David tensed. The cat studied him. Her pupils were narrow, alert. She yawned, revealing sharp fangs, before slowly getting to her feet. David sat up straighter. Saffron didn't pounce. She didn't hiss. Instead, she padded over to him, rubbing her body against his legs before curling up at his feet, purring softly. David blinked. He wasn't sure what surprised him more, the fact that she had chosen to be near him, or the strange feeling in his chest at the realization that she trusted him. His throat tightened. You don't know what's coming, do you? He whispered. Saffron flicked her tail, but didn't move. David exhaled, leaning back against the chair. He wasn't sure how long he stayed like that, staring down at the animal that had nearly taken everything from him. It still felt like a part of his family. At some point, exhaustion finally won. His eyelids grew heavy, his breathing slowed, and before he realized it, he drifted off. The sharp barking of Duke snapped David awake. His eyes flew open just as chaos erupted. Saffron had bolted upright, her body rigid. Duke was in the hallway, barking ferociously, his hackles raised, his body blocking the entrance to Ethan's room. Then a sound from outside. A metallic clink. David's blood ran cold. Someone was at the front door. He shot to his feet, heart pounding. He glanced at Saffron. Her ears were pinned back, her tail stiff, her eyes locked on the door. Who the hell would be outside at this hour? Claire suddenly appeared in the hallway, her face pale with sleep, her voice a terrified whisper. "David, what's going on?" Duke snarled. David held up a hand, motioning for her to stay back. Then another sound, this time from the window. His gut twisted. This wasn't just one person. There were multiple. Then a shadow moved. David grabbed the closest thing he could, a metal flashlight, his knuckles white as he gripped it. Another clink. The doorknob turned. David didn't think. He lunged forward, yanking the door open before whoever was outside could react. And what he saw nearly knocked the breath out of him. Two men stood on the porch. Dark clothing, masks covering their faces, gloved hands clutching a cage and a tranquilizer gun. His stomach dropped. They weren't burglars. They were here for Saffron. The illegal traders. The men froze, equally shocked to see him awake. Then, everything happened at once. Duke lunged. Saffron hissed violently. One of the men fired the tranquilizer gun. David dove forward, grabbing the nearest man's arm and slamming him against the doorframe. The tranquilizer dart missed, embedding itself in the couch instead. The second man stumbled back, trying to raise the cage, but Saffron was already airborne. She pounced. A guttural snarl ripped from her throat as her claws raked across the intruder's arm. The man screamed, falling backward, blood spraying across the porch. David barely registered Claire's shrieking, barely processed Ethan waking up and crying in the background. His only focus was stopping these men. The first man recovered, grabbing David by the collar, but Duke launched himself at him, his teeth sinking into the man's arm. Saffron was still on top of the second intruder, snarling, pinning him down like prey. Then, headlights flooded the yard. A van? Someone shouted from inside. "Leave them. Go." The injured man shoved Saffron off, scrambling to his feet, blood dripping down his sleeve. The first intruder kicked Duke off, stumbling back toward the vehicle. David tried to chase after them, but they were already retreating. The van's engine roared to life, tires screeching as it sped off into the night. And just like that, they were gone. The silence left behind was deafening. David's chest heaved. His hands shook. His body ached from the adrenaline dump. Claire was clutching Ethan, her face frozen in horror. Duke stood at the doorway, still snarling. And Saffron. Saffron sat in the middle of the porch, her golden eyes locked on the fading taillights. She had protected them. David swallowed hard, his throat dry. The wildlife team was coming in the morning. But now he wasn't so sure if he could let her go. The front yard was eerily silent now, the only sound being David's ragged breathing. The scent of blood lingered in the air, smeared across the porch where Saffron had lashed out at the intruders. Duke was still snarling, his stance tense, his body a shield between the house and the empty street beyond. Claire clutched Ethan tightly to her chest, her arms wrapped protectively around him as he whimpered softly. David ran a trembling hand through his hair, his mind still reeling from what had just happened. Saffron had saved them. A wild predator, the very same animal that had terrified them hours ago, had fought to protect their home. And now he had to decide what came next. Claire finally broke the silence, her voice hoarse. "We need to call the police." David nodded, but something inside him hesitated. He looked down at Saffron, who was still sitting in the same spot, her chest rising and falling heavily, her golden eyes locked on the driveway where the van had disappeared. She wasn't just some confused, unpredictable wild animal. She had known what she was doing, and that scared him even more. Would the authorities see her as a hero or as a threat? His gut twisted. We can't let them take her. Claire's head snapped toward him, eyes wide. David, are you serious? We were ready to let her go just a few hours ago. He met her gaze, his voice tight with emotion. And if she wasn't here, we'd be dead right now. That single sentence hung in the air. Claire swallowed hard, looking down at Ethan. He was still trembling, but was no longer crying. Instead, his wide eyes were locked onto Saffron. She saved us, Ethan whispered. Claire shut her eyes for a moment, then exhaled. David knew what she was thinking. If they called the authorities, they wouldn't just be reporting the intruders. They would be handing Saffron over to the system. And after tonight, after this, there was no telling what would happen to her. Would she be confiscated, taken to a research facility, put down? David's fist clenched. He wouldn't let that happen. Let's think, he said, lowering his voice. If we call the police, they'll ask about Saffron. They'll want to know why we have her. Then they'll take her, and we'll have no say in what happens next. Claire bit her lip. But those men, they might come back. David looked at the dark smears of blood on the porch. No, he said, they won't. He was sure of it. Those men had come expecting an easy retrieval. Instead, they had been mauled by a wild predator and nearly taken down by a loyal dog. They wouldn't risk another encounter. Not with her. Claire hesitated, then sighed. So what do we do? David turned to look at Saffron again. She was still watching him, her body low to the ground, her ears flicking toward every distant sound. She was still on guard. She still felt protective. David exhaled. We take her somewhere safe, he said. On our terms. Claire blinked. You mean? He nodded. We call Dr. Carter and tell her we need to relocate Saffron ourselves. We don't involve law enforcement. We get her to a sanctuary that won't treat her like some criminal or science experiment. Claire hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. Okay. David pulled out his phone and dialed the number. His fingers still shook as he pressed call. The phone rang once, twice. Then Dr. Carter picked up. David, she answered, sounding wide awake despite the early hour. Is something wrong? David inhaled sharply. Yeah, he said. Something happened. And we can't wait until morning. 30 minutes later, the headlights of an unmarked SUV cut through the darkness, pulling up outside the house. David and Claire had already packed a small bag, stuffing in whatever they could find, water, blankets, a first aid kit. Saffron sat calmly in the center of the living room, watching them. It was almost as if she knew something was happening. Dr. Carter stepped out of the vehicle, her sharp eyes scanning the house, taking in the scene immediately. She saw the claw marks on the porch, the bloodstains, the tension in David's face. What happened? She asked. David didn't waste time. The people who smuggled Saffron here, they came back. Dr. Carter's expression hardened. Did they take anything? Hurt anyone? David shook his head. But Saffron, she fought them off. If she hadn't been here, my family wouldn't be standing right now. Dr. Carter's gaze flickered towards Saffron. The cat held her stare, unblinking. Claire cleared her throat. We can't let the authorities take her. Dr. Carter sighed. That's not how this works. There are laws in place. Laws that don't protect animals like her, David interrupted. We both know if the wrong people get their hands on her, she'll be put down or locked away in some facility for the rest of her life. Dr. Carter didn't argue. Instead, she nodded. I have a contact, she said finally. A private wildlife refuge. No government involvement. They take in animals that can't be released into the wild but don't belong in captivity either. David's chest tightened with hope. But we have to go now, Dr. Carter added. Before anyone else comes looking for her. David glanced back at Claire and Ethan. His wife nodded. Ethan, clutching his mother's hand, whispered, She's going to be okay, right? Dr. Carter knelt down in front of him, her expression softening. We'll make sure she's safe. I promise. Ethan hesitated, then slowly let go of his mother's hand. He took one last step towards Saffron. The leopard cat lifted her head, ears twitching. Ethan raised a small hand and gently placed it on her head. For a brief moment, the room felt still. Then, Saffron leaned into the touch, rubbing her head against his palm. David swallowed hard. Then he took a deep breath and helped Dr. Carter load Saffron into the transport crate. As the SUV pulled away into the night, Ethan pressed his face against the window, watching until the last glimpse of her disappeared into the darkness. She was gone, but she was free. And for the first time since the nightmare had begun, David felt like they had done the right thing. 1 year later, the wind was crisp as David parked the car at the edge of the secluded wildlife sanctuary, deep in the rolling green hills miles away from any city. The sun had just begun to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and deep violet. Claire sat beside him, her hands resting on her lap, eyes fixed on the dirt path ahead. In the back seat, Ethan bounced in his seat, his small hands gripping his favorite stuffed leopard toy. He was older now, taller, more talkative, but his excitement today was different. They had finally come back. David had hesitated for months before agreeing to this trip. He wasn't sure if coming here would bring closure or open old wounds. Saffron had been a part of their family for years, and then in one night she had been gone. But this wasn't a story of loss. This was a story of letting go and doing what was right. Dr. Miriam Carter was already waiting at the gate when they stepped out of the car. She smiled warmly as she greeted them, shaking David's hand and then bending down to greet Ethan. "You ready to see her?" she asked gently. Ethan nodded furiously. David let out a breath, forcing himself to relax. "How has she been?" Dr. Carter's smile deepened. "She's doing better than we ever expected. It took her a few months to adjust to the environment, but now she moves through the sanctuary like she owns the place." David let out a soft chuckle. "That sounds like her." Claire squeezed his hand as Dr. Carter led them through the lush green pathways deeper into the sanctuary. Birds chirped overhead, the sound of rustling leaves blending with the distant calls of wild animals. Then they arrived at the enclosure. The area was massive, stretching into a dense forest. A shallow river cut through the terrain, and elevated wooden platforms had been built to simulate the high vantage points leopard cats favored in the wild. David scanned the area, but there was no sign of Saffron. Ethan tugged at Dr. Carter's sleeve. "Where is she?" Dr. Carter smiled. "She's in there, but she's the one who decides when she wants to be seen." David nodded. That made sense. Saffron had always been independent, always careful. She wouldn't just come running the second they arrived. Then movement. A soft rustling in the trees. A shadow flickered between the branches. And then, just as quietly as a whisper, she appeared. Saffron stepped onto one of the high wooden beams, her golden coat gleaming under the sunlight filtering through the canopy. Her eyes were sharp, observant, but there was no fear in them. No hesitation. Ethan lit up. "Saffron," he called out, his voice bright with excitement. Saffron's ears twitched. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze locking onto Ethan. For a second, David wasn't sure what would happen. Would she recognize them? Did she even remember who they were? Then she moved. With the grace of a predator, she leaped down onto the lower platforms, her muscles rippling beneath her fur. She landed lightly on the ground and took a few steps toward a fence, just close enough to let them see her up close. Ethan pressed his small hands against the wooden barrier, grinning from ear to ear. David felt his heart tighten. She was different now. There was a wildness in her movements that hadn't been there before, a confidence that proved she had finally found her place. And she was thriving. Claire wiped a tear from her eye and whispered, "She belongs here." David nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, she does." Saffron let out a low chuffing sound, watching them for a few moments longer. Then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she turned and disappeared back into the trees. David let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Ethan smiled up at him. "She's happy, Daddy." David put a hand on his son's shoulder, his chest filled with pride. "She is," he said, "and that's all that matters." As they turned to leave, David took one last look at the jungle where Saffron had vanished. She was no longer their pet, no longer a wild animal trapped in the wrong world. She was free, and she would always be a part of their story. As the family walked back toward the car, Ethan kept glancing over his shoulder, hoping for one last glimpse of Saffron. The golden-furred feline had disappeared into the dense foliage of the sanctuary, leaving behind only the memory of their brief but powerful reunion. David placed a reassuring hand on Ethan's shoulder. "She's where she belongs, buddy." Ethan nodded, but his small fingers clutched at the hem of his shirt, a telltale sign that his young mind was still processing everything. Claire reached for David's hand as they made their way down the winding path leading back to the entrance. Dr. Carter walked alongside them, her arms crossed as she observed the family with quiet curiosity. You know, most people who surrender exotic animals never come back to visit. It's rare to see this much emotional attachment. David sighed. She was part of our family for a long time. Dr. Carter nodded. That's exactly what makes these situations so complicated. There's a fine line between love and captivity. I'm not saying you didn't love her. I can see you did. But I hope after today, you realize that loving her meant letting her go. David stopped walking and looked back at the sanctuary's entrance. The large, metal-reinforced wooden gate stood tall, separating the human world from the wild. For a moment, he imagined what life would have been like had they ignored the warning signs, had they convinced themselves that they were enough for Saffron. The answer was painfully clear. She would have either hurt someone, been locked away, or worse. Claire must have sensed the shift in his thoughts because she gave his hand a gentle squeeze. We did the right thing. David exhaled and nodded. Yeah, we did. Ethan frowned. But will she remember us? Dr. Carter smiled. Maybe. Animals remember people for different reasons. Some associate humans with food, some with safety, and some just by scent. She might not remember the details, but she'll remember that you weren't a threat. Ethan seemed to think about that for a long moment before giving a small nod. That's okay, then. David couldn't help but smile. The way Ethan processed things so simply sometimes amazed him. He had spent months agonizing over the guilt, the what-ifs, and yet his son had just decided in a matter of seconds that it was okay as long as Saffron was happy. Maybe he could learn something from that. As they reached the parking lot, Dr. Carter turned toward them. If you ever want updates on her, just let me know. I can't promise she'll always be around when you visit, but I can at least let you know how she's doing. Claire smiled. We'd like that. David pulled out his wallet, retrieving a small donation. I know it's not much, but Dr. Carter shook her head, pushing his hand back. Your support means more than money. You did something that most people can't. You let go when it mattered. David swallowed thickly and nodded. Ethan tugged at his father's sleeve. Can we go home now? David ruffled his son's hair. Yeah, buddy. Let's go home. As they pulled out of the sanctuary's parking lot and onto the long stretch of road leading back toward the city, David felt something deep inside him begin to settle. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't carrying the weight of regret. Saffron was safe. She was where she belonged. And so were they. The ride home was quiet, filled with the rhythmic hum of the car's tires against the pavement and the occasional flicker of headlights from passing vehicles. Ethan had curled up in the back seat, his stuffed leopard clutched tightly against his chest. His eyes were half-lidded, exhausted from the day's events, though David could tell he wasn't fully asleep. Claire sat beside him in the passenger seat, her gaze fixed out the window, watching as the world outside shifted from rolling fields to the occasional clusters of suburban houses. The sanctuary felt miles away now, both physically and emotionally. David's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. It's strange. Claire turned to him. What is? David exhaled. How quiet everything feels now. After everything that's happened, it's like the world just keeps moving, like none of it even mattered. Claire gave him a small, knowing smile. It mattered to us. David nodded but didn't speak for a moment. As they passed a dimly lit rest stop, the memories flooded back, the first night they brought Saffron home, the late nights spent researching her diet, the laughter when she used to curl up in strange places, and the terrifying moment when her instincts nearly changed everything. I thought I'd feel more relieved, he admitted. But part of me still feels like I failed her. Claire reached over, resting her hand on his arm. David, you didn't fail her. You gave her a second chance. And today, you saw it with your own eyes. She's thriving. David sighed. I know. It's just hard. A small voice from the back seat piped up. I think she's happy. David glanced at the rearview mirror, seeing Ethan peering up at him sleepily. His little hand squeezed his stuffed leopard as if trying to hold on to something intangible. I think she liked seeing us, Ethan continued. Even if she didn't stay for long. David swallowed the lump in his throat. Yeah, buddy, he murmured. I think she did too. For the rest of the drive, The conversation faded into a comfortable silence. They were all tired, not just physically, but emotionally. There was a certain kind of exhaustion that came with letting go. By the time they pulled into their driveway, the sky had darkened completely. The house stood still, familiar, but different. It was the same place they had lived for years, but the absence of Saffron made it feel emptier. Ethan yawned, rubbing his eyes as Claire unbuckled him and helped him inside. David lingered by the car for a moment, staring up at the sky. A part of him had expected this overwhelming sense of relief when this was all over, but instead, there was something quieter. Acceptance. The chapter had closed, but the story wasn't forgotten. As he stepped inside and shut the door behind him, he finally allowed himself to breathe. They were home, and for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. The house felt eerily still that night. David stood in the doorway of Ethan's room, watching as his son curled up beneath the blankets, his stuffed leopard tucked securely beneath his arm. The soft rise and fall of Ethan's chest told him that exhaustion had finally won, his small body sinking into the depths of sleep. For a moment, David simply stood there, watching, listening. The night air outside was quiet, filled only with the distant hum of crickets and the occasional rustling of leaves. Claire appeared beside him, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's exhausted." David nodded. "It's been a long day." They lingered for a moment before Claire gently pulled him away, leading him toward their own bedroom. Their bed was neatly made, almost untouched since that night. It was strange, the way everything inside the house looked exactly the same, yet felt so different. David sat on the edge of the bed, running a hand down his face. "You think she's really happy?" Claire hesitated before sitting beside him. "I think she's free," she said softly. "And I think that's what really matters." David exhaled slowly. Freedom. That was what they had given Saffron. And yet, a part of him still ached. He wasn't sure if it was regret, guilt, or just the lingering habit of looking for her in the corners of their home. Claire reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I miss her too." David turned his head, searching her expression. Claire had been the strong one through all of this. She had been the voice of reason, the one who reminded him that this was the right decision. And yet, he could see it in her eyes. She felt it too. The emptiness. The quiet absence of something that had once been woven into their lives. They sat there in silence for a long moment before Claire sighed, standing up and pulling back the blankets. "Come on," she murmured. "Let's get some sleep." David hesitated before finally lying down beside her. The bed was warm, familiar. But as he closed his eyes, his mind drifted to a jungle far away, where a golden-eyed predator moved through the trees, free, wild, and untethered. And for the first time, the thought didn't hurt. It felt right. 1 week later, life had settled into something resembling normalcy. David had returned to work, Claire had resumed her usual routines, and Ethan was back in school, adapting faster than anyone. But there were small reminders. The claw marks near the back door that they never painted over. The scratches on the wooden floor where Saffron had once stretched after long naps. The instinctual glance toward the living room rug, where she had often curled up in the evenings. She was gone, but not forgotten. Ethan still talked about her sometimes. Not in sadness, but in fondness. He would tell his friends that Saffron lived in a big jungle now, where she could run and climb and hunt as much as she wanted. "She's happier there," he would say. And David believed him. Then one evening, as he was sorting through mail, an envelope caught his eye. It was from Dr. Carter. He opened it slowly, expecting some formal sanctuary report, but instead, he found a single photograph. His breath hitched. It was a photo of Saffron. She was perched on a high wooden beam, staring into the distance, her golden fur glistening in the sunlight. She looked strong, confident, free. A handwritten note was scrawled at the bottom. "She's thriving. Thought you want to know. Carter." David exhaled slowly, his fingers tracing the edges of the photo. Claire appeared beside him, reading over his shoulder. A small, soft smile touched her lips. David took a deep breath, then placed the photo carefully on the kitchen counter, where he knew it would stay. Because no matter how much time passed, no matter how much life moved forward, Saffron would always be a part of their story. And now, for the first time, he truly believed she was exactly where she was meant to be.